So, Platypus focuses on the problems and history of the left, the tasks of the left. And the left is this political category that is utopian, and it is oriented towards the transformation of society toward freedom. And it's also like new, right? So it's like a term that is like specifically modern and has to do with like emerges during capitalism. Technology, in a sense, is like this old thing, right? People make tools, human beings make tools, the tools become more complicated, they become machines, right? So there's a way in which you can see that like all of human civilization has like had a kind of technology, although technology only emerges as a category with capitalism. And actually, so the left as a concept emerges during the French Revolution, and like a decade later, like technology as a concept also emerges in like 1803. And it emerges because there's the Industrial Revolution and there's this need to understand all of these sweeping changes throughout industry as one whole thing. And so it's like an old term, in a sense it's Greek, technologos, right? But like for the Greeks that meant something different, it meant something related to art and craft. But after the Industrial Revolution there's like was this need to understand these sweeping changes in society and see them as this like one thing. So like reappropriating the Greek to understand the present. So like, yeah, so technology itself is this old thing, but it's a new term, and in capitalism it's specifically different, okay? So, yeah, so what about that? What about technology is different in capitalism? Well, on the one hand, science progresses, right? And so like technology, as science progresses, technology sort of like relies on science in new ways in capitalism, after the Industrial Revolution, like certainly in the 20th century, but like even at the end of the 19th, that it didn't before. So like let me give some examples to like make that concrete. You could imagine creating the steam engine without physics, without really knowing about physics, right? Like just from your personal experience, knowing about like how things work, just like personal experience, you can imagine coming up with such a device. And in fact, the Greeks had a sort of steam engine, actually, but they didn't think to use it for oriented into production. But yeah.
So in actual fact, the first steam engines in the Industrial Revolution had almost nothing to do with physics. However, an entire branch of physics, namely thermodynamics, is based upon theoretical reflection on steam engines and ultimately led to the problem of making steam engines. But so actually in that one case, the causation went from technological progress to scientific progress, in which people were trying to think scientifically and analytically about machines that already existed and how they could be made more efficient. And it's really only relatively late, even in the history of capitalism, that progress in technology depends fundamentally on progress in science. But science in that sense is also even more a product of, in the modern sense, a product of bourgeois society, if not of capitalism. Sorry.
That's okay. So like technology. So the category of the left emerges with the French Revolution. The category of technology as a way of understanding society emerges 10 years later. And at the same time, like basically at the same time, you have the Luddites as this like workers movement that emerged. It's like kind of funny historically that these things basically all happen at the same time, which is like this like massive revolution that is like happening in the world. And it's like, so what are the Luddites? The Luddites were workers, textile workers in Britain who objected to, so like they were like trained, skilled, master like weavers, textile workers, And as machinery was being introduced into the factory, all of a sudden these like skills that they had mastered over their like lives were completely useless. And like the machinery made them work harder and faster than they had to work before, and they were de-skilled, so they were paid less. So it's like all of these things happened with the introduction of technology, of like machinery into the factory, and they like rebelled against this by smashing the machines. And so it's like they were called the Luddites, and it's like that name that is like continued to be used for a personal affect, which is like a personal disposition to be like anti-technology. Even though like the Luddites themselves weren't actually anti-technology per se, but they were like using the smashing of the machine as a bargaining chip, as a way of negotiating their wages and their working conditions. And what's interesting about them is that like Marx and Marxists saw them as sort of the beginnings of the workers' movement that was like growing in scope, growing in effect, and was going to like, you know, lead to socialism. Right? This was like the workers' movement, which is going to grow and like become conscious. And so it's like like perhaps the Luddites were smashing the machines, and they were maybe smashing the wrong object because they wanted like, right? But the Marxists like,
instead of smashing the machines, the idea is they should take over the factory and expropriate them.
sure, smash capitalism by taking over the factory. Okay, but so today, this term Luddite means something very different. It no longer has the political valence, but it has like a sort of, it connotes like a personal disposition of like being, of like how do you feel about technology? Now I think that personal disposition is still like indicative of something, but it's like, it also, I want to just register the difference between actual Luddites and like Luddism. And so with technology, there's these two different perspectives that kind of it gives rise to. One is like techno-utopianism, this sense that technology and like progress will make possible new freedom. And then the other is Luddism, which is that technology reduces us to machines. It makes us stupid. It makes us idiots. It atomizes us, etc. Okay, so like, I want to now jump forward to the 20th century and give like a sort of periodization of computers. So there's like, and this part is kind of tentative, this periodization historically, but I think like so it's got to start with the Second World War. Okay, so there's the Second World War where, first I'm just going to give the period. So there's the Second World War, post-war, there's 1968, post-1968, there's like 1989 or 90s period, and then there's post-2001 period, and then there's this 2009 period. So those are these different periods. And so I think the reason you have to start with post-war is because computers basically are invented and conceived during the war. Okay? So it's like it's during the Second World War that basically there's like these two people, von Neumann and Alan Turing. And Alan Turing is like this British, he's like, both of them are considered the fathers of computer science, but they were both mathematicians, and they were both working on the war effort. So Alan Turing in 1936 conceives of this thing, like a universal computer, which basically makes it possible to have computers that would be programmable. So instead of needing to be re-hardwired or redesigned with hardware, you could program them. So it's like, after this point that it's theoretically possible to have a computer programmer, or it's theoretically possible to have a software engineer. Before that it's impossible, it's inconceivable, or at least like not theoretically possible. So both of these people actually, during the war effort, designed computers for the Allied forces, right? So Alan Turing like helps build and design computers to crack the Nazi codes, the Enigma machine.
There was a movie about this.
There's been like a bunch of movies about this, right? And then also von Neumann builds computers for the Manhattan Project to do calculations for the atom bomb. So like out of that is when like in the post-war period you start to have basically military like you have like ARPA, the Advanced Research and Projects Agency in the Pentagon, like funding research for the beginnings of computers. And it's like in that period when in like 1960 there's this guy like Linkletter. He worked with ARPA and he like wrote this article on human computer symbiosis, which basically like completely envisions what research would look like for like for scientists in the future. He envisioned what like interacting with a computer, doing signal processing, doing these calculations, etc. And also envisioned like an internet, right? The reason that the internet was important at that time was that computers were huge. So the idea was that there was going to be only a few computers and that you would have to connect to them somehow, right? So then in 1963, he writes this kind of joking memo to like his colleagues in ARPA, and he's like, it's a memo on the intergalactic computer network, which like was what they thought they were going to make, right? And so it's in 1968, you have like the ARPA issues a request for proposal, like an RFP, to build the internet. In 1968, there's the first public demonstration of like human-computer interacting with a monitor, and it might not be a mouse, it might be a LiDAR pen, but anyway, it's like you get the picture. By that time already, designs for a laptop, like a portable computer, were already around. And like a lot of the theory that goes into machine learning and AI today was basically there already. Like when Linkletter wrote his essay in 1960, he talks about speech recognition as like an important thing for computers to do, because like you're going to want to have generals to be able to like, who don't want to be able to type, who aren't going to need to type, to be able to issue orders to the computer. And so he thought that speech recognition was 5 years away in 1960. Right? So he was like off by an order of magnitude, but he was basically right about how the theory would work. He was basically right. What? Just like Trotsky, sure. Okay. So like that's this post-war period where like the theory of the internet and like the theory of computers is like matures. And it's after that period that it starts, like Silicon Valley is basically born, post-1968. Okay? So there's like, that's when, like, Apple is founded in this period, post-1968.
You also have the microchip.
Also, there's the microchip, there's Intel, etc. And this whole time there's Moore's Law at play, which is this notion that, like, the number of transistors that you can fit on a chip will double every 18 months. Right. So like interestingly, like Moore's law basically no longer applies because the distance between transistors now is like within atoms. So like it basically no longer applies, or it's soon going to no longer apply. The other thing about Moore's law that's funny is that it's true that it doubles every 18 months, but the amount of manpower that goes into doubling it also like increases. So like it's like there's diminishing marginal returns clearly in many ways with this problem, and it can't sustain. But like nonetheless, like what's interesting about technology under capitalism, which is different than technology in all of human history, is that capitalism needs technological progress. It like requires it in a way that was not required before. That's like, okay, so basically the point of this Salon Talk is to make lots of provocative assertions to have a discussion, and so I'm just like going to keep making them. But that was, okay. So, okay, 1968. Right, so then, it's also during this second period, 68 to 89, that you get the whole,
This is implicit in what you're saying, but it might not. This is a government program.
Oh, ARPA.
ARPA, right? This is not private
military
enterprise. This is the military. So the people who built the internet originally were the U.S., the Pentagon.
Yeah, the Pentagon.
Right. Okay. Emphasize it's not private enterprise.
No, although it was public-private. They issued an RFP, like they issued a request for proposal from these like private companies to build it. But they were the ones that were like, you need to build this, so we're going to pay somebody to build it. They were like, in 1968, it's actually 50 years ago that they issued the RFP, and in '69 they actually built it. Okay. I mean, of course, like the other, like this periodization also kind of maybe too neatly fits very well with sort of like other political periodizations that you would imagine, namely like the post-war periodization, the importance of 1968, like politically, the emergence of the New Left, the strikes in France, the student strikes, the free speech movement, all these things emerge in 68, and that like also has an influence on Silicon Valley, which is right there, and it has like an influence on the direction that computers go. So the direction that computers go is like toward the personal, right? Which was already sort of designed before in the 60s, but like there's this direction toward the personal, toward the making the computer personal, making it this like personal thing that's going to allow for like all sorts of new individuality, unique expression, free communication, new relationships. It's going to tear down borders. It's going to like free exchange of information. All of these things are post-68. It's like there's this new techno-utopianism, like digital utopianism. There's like hobbyists and people like, it's like, you can even see it to a lesser extent in Stranger Things. Like there's like, because they're like on the computer and they're like programming, but they're these like nerdy kids and like, but it's like, you can see it in all these different things. Okay, so the Whole Earth catalog was like this giant book that I think even had like all of the email addresses in it, but it also had like all of the different things that were like, it was like the idea was to like be international. It kind of has this neoliberal, hippie, new left imagination, all wrapped into one. Because it's like, it's across borders, it's like free exchange of information, individuality, like...
Live in a yurt in the woods, growing organic food.
Well, like on the internet, one of the first gatherings that was organized on the internet was like a Grateful Dead show. In fact, like it's like the tour of the Grateful Dead from the 60s to 1995 that kind of like is the arc of that second period of the internet, which is like Steve Wozniak, the founder of Apple, one of the founders, is like a total deadhead. He's the one that organizes the Grateful Dead show, right? They're all like the same people. That's like what's also kind of strange about it. Okay, so then it's in the 90s when like this kind of, there's like this transition. Like the Whole Earth catalog basically dies and it gives birth instead to Wired magazine, which is kind of like the modern, like the contemporary inheritor. And it's like in the 90s that all of a sudden everybody in the world has an email. Well, not like a majority of people. It's like becomes mainstream to have an email address in like 1995, right? It becomes mainstream to be on the internet. It becomes like America Online. All of these things become very mainstream. And like it's like it leads up right up until 2001 with this like first tech bubble, right? Where like Google is founded in the 90s, Apple has already been around, but Apple comes out and kind of is reborn in the 90s also. They have their like messaging, think different, right? That's their, like, it's like there's this techno-utopianism that like people are going to be able to think differently, they're going to be like new freedom, new individuality, new communication.
The famous Christmas '84 ad for one of the first Apple PC, personal computer, with the smashing of Big Brother.
Oh, I don't know that ad.
Oh, that's
it's like Ridley Scott directed it.
Yeah.
See, the ad that kind of sticks in my head is in the 90s was on like public television, which was like, it was like an advertisement for the internet, and it was like the internet is this place where, you know, your gender doesn't matter. You can talk to people of different races, disabilities, countries. None of that matters because you're just minds meeting. And that was like the utopian promise that like I remember in the 90s, right? So what happens in 2001 after the tech crash? First of all, I think the companies that succeed, Amazon is also a 90s phenomenon, right? The companies that like succeed through the crash, I think saw like the future or like were able to capitalize on it in a special way. So like, and I'll talk more about that, but what happens in the 2000s is, to go back to this periodization, there's like social media, and basically as the internet becomes mainstream, it was like, so there was like the Electronic Frontier Foundation thinking of the internet as this like free frontier. It was like anything could happen. It was like this space of freedom. And it's like in the 2000s, people like sort of realize that actually like they don't want a frontier. They don't want a free space. They want businesses, and they want like their actual selves, and they want to be able to express their authentic selves, and that means like Facebook. It means reproducing social life onto the internet instead of having this internet be this like alternate utopia or something. It's actually like what actually is much more credible or meaningful, workable. It's like social life reproduces itself on the internet. And so that is like the 2000s period, and it kind of like comes to a head sort of in 2009, where like all of a sudden after that, it's like the internet is this like, it was this place that was going to be like, it was going to allow for radical new democracy and individuality. And after that, it's like, it's a threat to democracy. And it's like Donald Trump and ISIS. It's like terrorist cells and hate speech. It's like it's this thing that is like addicting and making us stupid and atomizing us instead of doing all the things that like the techno-utopians had hoped for. But maybe it's doing both. I don't mean to come down on one side of that question, but anyway, there's like these two different trends that are happening. I want to say one more thing about Google in the 90s. Which is that even as, like, Moore's Law in the 90s was still, like, alive and well. It was, like, still progressing apace. But what was interesting is that even though Moore's Law was still happening, the internet was still growing way faster than Moore's Law could keep up with. And it was, like, actually the realization of, like, Larry Page and Sergey Brin, the founders of Google, was that, like, the internet is so big that, like, we basically need two things. Like they had like two key realizations. One was like that they needed to like was a way of like understanding how to rank things better on the web, and the other was, and I think is really important, was an ability and a realization of how important it was to parallelize computing because the chips weren't growing fast enough, right? So Google's like parallel computing is like gives it this decisive edge. And like is one of the reasons why in the 90s it emerges, and then in the 2000s it becomes like this like massive thing. And it's like what that means is like the computer goes from being like in the 60s and the 50s where there was like a mainframe, and the imagination of the internet was that there would be 3 or 4 computers that you might connect to then becoming personal, where like everybody has a computer, to then again becoming a mainframe again in the form of a data center. Which is basically that like the internet is one big computer, and this is like Eric Schmidt's whole thing. Eric Schmidt's like the chairman of Google. It's like this whole thing, like realization that like, well, the cloud is the computer, and it's like it's a funny term, cloud, because it's like actually just a data center or a bunch of data centers that are networked together, but it's one computer again. And it's what's also interesting if you look at the hardware is that like the hardware goes in the beginning, it's like mass-produced commodity hardware, which was a competitive advantage. But then again, it turns back, and it's like all specialized hardware again, right? So like the way that the relationship between hardware goes back again. Anyway.
What's an example of the specialized hardware?
Oh, so it used to be that you basically like the first Google was like you go to Best Buy, you buy 1,000 desktop computers and you string them together, and that's Google. Now, like, it's specialized computers that are strung together, that are designed at the hardware level, not just the software level. And that's true of all the cloud. It's like, it's just an industry standard. Okay. What was it? What else did I want? Oh, I wanted to say another thing about technology, which is that, like, there's this strange thing, which is that as our ability to understand the world with science becomes better, the integration of technology and science makes it so that our actual world becomes, in a sense, more mysterious, right? Like the clock, right, the clock in the 1500s was like a complex machine, but basically everybody would know how it works. But like nobody has a clue how this thing works. Nobody has a clue how, I mean, you know, you could figure it out, you could learn. It's not like a total mystery, but it's basically a mystery, right? And so there's this like funny way in which like the progress in science and technology actually makes the world less understandable on its face. Yeah. I wanted to say something else about unionizing software engineers, which is just like, you could like, there's a question of whether or not like software engineers are like workers. I would say that they are. And then there's this question of like, well, why don't we think about a software engineering union? And maybe there's a lot of reasons why we don't. But to me, it seems pretty clear that like what software engineers are doing is like basically working in a kind of knowledge productive factory or something. They're like producing code. And the reasons why there's like union seems so remote. It's like not even a possibility. It's not a practical possibility. It's not like, it's just a kind of like funny thought figure. The reason why has like more to do with politics than it does have to do with anything per se about technology. Okay, that's all. Does that? Sorry? That's all.
That's a weird space to clap in.
Yeah.
So one thing I kept thinking about, did you have any questions that you wanted to ask us, or should I just...
Well, I kind of asked a lot during the talk.
So, for those who don't know me, I'm an art critic, so I deal with the fields of art history and art criticism, which is like where dead philosophy goes to die. But there's a making me think about like the failure of critical theory in the late 20th century to be able to understand what you described. And the internet has become this boogeyman. Like there is almost this moral panic. And oddly enough, I think kind of two of the most cited essays on this came out in your year, 1968. I think like Debord's Society, the Spectacle, and Baudrillard's Simulacra and Simulations, Welcome to the Desert of the Real, and this like moral terror that like the internet would take away the real world, or photos would take away the real world, and then it becomes heightened.
Do you think that was about I think that people were already terrified by television.
There was a lot of that, yeah. But I'm curious, like, I mean, you offered a more succinct kind of understanding of what it was to be online than I think every post-structuralist art historian of
Well,
so, like, what are we to make of that failure, that kind of terror?
well, I think like there's like postmodernists, like I mean like Hart and Negri, right? Who think that we're like living in this like postmodern era of like where there's like no longer factory production. Well, first of all, like it's not true. Like there's still factory production, but also like tech companies are like also factory production in many ways. First of all, like there are massive computers that are basically factories. Second of all, like there's all of these engineers that have to like program the factories, program these like giant machines. And then there's like there's like a new class of worker that is like this gives rise to also, actually, is like the data mining person. And I'm using that term in a funny way because like normally people talk about like data mining as this thing that like an engineer does. It's like what Linklater was thinking when he was like, you take all this data and you process it. And that is in a sense like data mining. That is how it's used in the industry, that term. But then there's like, what data are they often mining? Often they are mining like people that they pay to click things on a computer. And they pay them a few pennies to click something on a computer. And then you mine that data. So like, in a way, it's like, I think that the analogy is kind of off. And it's a tellingly off analogy. Because we think of like this like data scientist as a data miner, but actually the data scientist is like this engineer of this giant mine, and there's all these people working in the mine, and they're working in the mine by clicking on the screen, and they're being paid a few cents for every click. And every penny, every click that they contribute is slowly contributing to these like models and signals that like these engineers are going to then extract. But like that's like a new class of worker, which is like completely atomized. They work in their basement and they make like a quarter of minimum wage. But that's like another. So there's like two new classes of workers that are created by technology. Oh, the other thing I wanted to touch on was like the fundamental relationship between technology and work, which is like going back to the Luddites, right? Which is that like technology changes work, right? It makes it so that certain jobs become de-skilled. You no longer need mastery to do them. Certain jobs no longer exist at all. And then it also creates new jobs, right? It does all of those things. And the strange thing, like the utopian imagination, certainly of Marx and of Marxists, like in the left in the 19th century, was that technology was going to make it so that work would not become necessary at all, or at least that this could be overcome or transformed in some way. But instead, and what they observed already in the 19th century was that instead of work becoming superfluous, it's the worker in the factory that becomes even more and more superfluous. And so that's like an observation in the 19th century, and that's still true. And it's like the grindingness of the machine. It's like if you think about Charlie Chaplin in modern times, like working with the machine, he's part of the machine. It's like the new Charlie Chaplin in modern times, the new factory is like people clicking on a computer screen in their basement.
So how do you understand the fascination with people with cyborgs?
Well, the other thing is that so going back to Linklater's like essay of human-computer symbiosis, it's like there's this question of like computers allow us to think new things, right? Like Steve Jobs called them like the bicycles for the brain. That was like how he thought about it. But in the process, we also like start to think like computers. And it's like there's this like I don't know, everybody that like uses a smartphone, we're like really good at touch typing with our thumbs, which is a strange thing. Like it's like we have this like complete like it's just like integrated into our body in a way that like touch typers historically like they needed to like place their hands on the typewriter and it needed to be in a certain place and they would like feel it. But we no longer need to feel it because it's all just like virtual. We just kind of know where it is. And if you ask me like where the cue is on the keyboard, like I probably couldn't like tell you, but I could feel it and then tell you, right? Like, and so it's just like this sense that it's just like part of me already. And I think that process is like. Oh, the other thing I wanted to bring up is like it's after 2009 in that period where like all of these tech founders and CEOs start to raise the problem of AI, artificial intelligence. So like Bill Gates and Elon Musk and all of these people are like AI is like very potentially a threat to humanity. And that might be rationally true, like there might be some truth to that threat, maybe. It might be reasonable. But like I think at the same time it's also betraying a sort of Luddism or fear of capitalism, which is like then transposed onto technology. I think that often when people talk about technology as like, especially like there's the book, What Does Technology Want? Which is like, which does, you know, like transposes, projects retroactively technology onto all of human history and thinks about the trajectory of technology. But like, I think that's really like, that's just like a obfuscation transposition of this like other thing that you could project retroactively onto all of human society, which is capitalism. And there's this question of like, what does capitalism want? Capitalism needs technical progress and needs progress to sustain itself. Or not? I mean, it does, I think. But I disagree with you.
What?
What was the argument for capitalism needing constant technological progress to sustain itself again?
Oh, the promise of technological progress is that it's going to allow for more efficient production on a grander scale. It's going to make things cheaper, and you're going to be able to produce more of them. It's this need to increase production, which is inherent to capitalism.
It's not that technological progress didn't exist before capitalism, but it was much slower. And what was different about it was that the social order didn't depend upon it. In other words, you can actually trace in the Middle Ages technical progress. It's not as though everything was stagnant, but the social order, there wasn't any built-in mechanism that forced technological development. Under capitalism is continuously geared towards technological development. It's built into the structure of the economic system in a way that was not true under feudalism, was even less true under slave society. So in that sense, there's a constant incentive to make technological improvements of a kind that never existed for most of human history. There were smaller incentives and improvements happened very slowly, but it wasn't systemic.
I mean, technological progress doesn't just go one way historically. There's also technological regress. Like people lose technology, like technology becomes lost. The ability to do things is lost. Like I think if you go to Rome, you can see these obelisks that are in the center of every piazza. And these obelisks were the Romans went to Egypt, took these Egyptian obelisks and took them back to Rome and put them up in every piazza. And in the Middle Ages, or after Rome fell, some of the obelisks collapsed, right? That just happens. But they were so heavy and so big that people could no longer move them because the technology to be able to move them and the social capacity that was required to move them no longer existed. And so it wasn't until the Renaissance that the obelisks were then re-erected.
Also, but Roman cement was never.
But so it's in the middle period. It's not it's in the middle of the marketplace. Everybody had to walk around this obelisk that was fallen over and collapsed. It was there was still a marketplace. People still lived there, but they walked around because they couldn't lift it back up again.
Okay. See, I would actually somewhat disagree with it because I think that here, what is actually being conflated is technological regression and social regression. So I think if you look at it on a global scale, that it's pretty hard to argue for any actual global technological regression. At best, maybe periods of technological stagnation. I think that what you saw in, say, Western Europe in the Dark Ages, not the Middle Ages, is economic and social collapse. So if Rome went from being a city of 1 million people under the Roman Empire, which it didn't become again until the beginning of the 20th century, to being a city of 5,000 or 10,000 people, right? And you have all these ruins, that's really about an economic and social collapse. I think actually
it's also what technology was available.
Technology was lost.
The question is with the obelisk specifically, is it a question of could you find 500 people to push the obelisk up, or was it a question of whether you could find and build a crane to do that function?
Okay, but two things. One, I would argue, this is a side thing. One, I would argue that there were other places in the civilized world where they could have done that, right? So if you went to the Byzantine Empire or China at that time, there would have been plenty of people who could do that. So I think that the image that one has of technological regression, I think that that's actually an almost, particularly at a global scale, almost unheard of phenomenon.
What do you mean?
That what you actually, it's really rare to find an example of the image that you have of post-nuclear war. People go back to the Middle Ages. In the actual Middle Ages, a social structure collapsed, but I actually think that if you look purely at the technological level of the Middle Ages, you would actually not find regression from the Roman Empire. What you would find is a regression at the level of social organization, and particularly in the later parts, you would actually find significant progress, even though at a very different type of social organization that would seem inferior. I mean, this is a purely
There's also a question of like education.
antiquarian.
There's also a question of education and like whether or not like what was known and what people knew.
Right, but like when we think for our technology, right, to build something like this, you need a lot of technical and scientific knowledge. Other types of technology, like most of the knowledge is knowledge passed down by craftsmen. It's the knowledge of hands and eyes. It's not theoretical knowledge. And even if you go well into the capitalist period, I think you will find, I mean, this is maybe a digression, I think you would find, for example, that what held up progress in the steam engine was not about scientific knowledge. It's like being able to weld parts with sufficient precision. It's a lot of like engineering technical details, not like some big theoretical breakthrough. It's like, and I think like the question again raised by like Gabe's narrative about computers is, Gabe is basically saying, well, for the last 50 years you haven't really had any big
Theoretical progress.
theoretical progress. It's not like computer science has made these great breakthroughs. It's just you have more cheap computing power that just kind of builds upon it, and you have a lot of people breaking down these little tasks.
Well, I think what's crucial to what you're saying, that what we see in the Middle Ages is a social and economic decline, not a technological decline. The technology reflects the needs and structure of the society. So there's this common misconception that the medievals in Europe simply forgot or lapsed the technology to be able to render realistic figures in illustration and sculpture. When this was clearly not the case. They didn't forget, they had different social priorities. It wasn't that they couldn't render, because at certain points in the Middle Ages you do see rather brilliant rendering. It was the technology reflected the society in different ways. It wasn't that they had forgotten how to draw.
At the same time, though, at least in the immediate aftermath of the fall of the Western Roman Empire, archaeologists have observed marked declines in the quality of pottery, in the quality of home construction, in a variety of categories of just material life as they relate to what could alternately be described as technology or craftsmanship. And in the Western Roman world, at least in some parts of it, a recovery to about the level attained at the late Roman Empire didn't occur until the 12th century, or sometimes even as late as the 19th century. And these are archaeological findings. I believe the book, I actually should cite a book, I forget the author's name, it was The Fall of Rome and the End of a Civilization, or the End of Civilization, titled like that. But I guess it's questionable whether we're dealing with technology as such or just craftsmanship. I mean, is it coherent to apply technology as a category to the ancients and medievals?
Well, right. I mean, my argument was that, like, although they did not understand their society, like their life and society in that way, and certainly the role of what we would call technology, like it didn't play the same role at all. Like certainly, like they made tools, but the thing is, like they made tools, but the tools like didn't need to change. Like innovation was a dirty word, and like it was bad, right? Like, and you would have new science, maybe, but like it wouldn't need to be like applied to production because there would be no reason for it. So it's the reason that like the Greeks or the Romans could like build a steam engine basically, but like not use it for anything in terms of like that would be productive for society, except for like to like move the doors on in a religious setting. so that it looked like it was this, like, they wanted to, like, make the doors look like they moved on their own, so that it was, like, a religious experience, but it had nothing to do with, like, anything else that we would see as, like, productive for society. And, like, the tools themselves, like, weren't something that was, like, gonna be an object to be changed, right? Because the tools themselves were, like, these, like, inseparable from the guild, like, special cast of people that were, like, working with those tools, who had developed in, like, relationships and mastery of, like, that particular environment and those particular tools. Society wasn't, like, dynamically, rapidly changing before capitalism, during, like,
I mean,
that during, like, the history of for most of the history of civilization.
yeah. I mean, I would definitely say it's questionable if even the phrase productive for society would have made sense if you said it to an ancient Greek person.
Right. But we could like, there's certain categories that we can project backwards, but certain certain concepts that don't project back. Right? Like, we could project backwards the concept of technology and recognize that there's, like, some problems with doing that, but still we can project backward. We can, like, understand that, and it sort of makes sense, even though, like, recognizing that they wouldn't have thought about it in that way. But, like, the category of the left, like, can't really be projected backwards in the same way. Like, there wasn't a historical left. There wasn't. So, like, what? Yeah.
Well, an analogy I would use is feudalism. When feudalism was really in flower, there was nobody who, in the High Middle Ages, nobody had a concept of feudalism. So feudalism itself, historically, is a bourgeois concept to describe a pre-bourgeois society or survival. But it's perfectly legitimate as a concept, even though the people who were living in it didn't actually have a need for that category, because they would have had to compare it to some other type of society, and they didn't have the historical consciousness to do so.
It's what makes, like, capitalism strange, is that it's during capitalism we not only name all of human history, but we also name our present moment. And it was like, it's that aspect which is, like, there's a utopian aspect to that, which is that, if we're able to name our present moment, we're also able to make our present society an object of change, and maybe we could do that in a conscious way and usher in a new era of socialism. Like, that's Marxism. Thinking that, like, understanding that society, like, capitalism was creating the possibility for socialism, and, like, technology is a part of that, but it's, like, also this, like, there's a politics, a political question too. And so I, like, Trotsky, like, I was just, when I was preparing for this talk, I was like, I was trying to find this one quote by Trotsky where I think, and I couldn't find it, so maybe I'm wrong, but, like, he says, like, he's wondering, like, how could it be in the era of the light bulb that, like, people still believe in God? It's a strange thing. And, like, just sort of, like, thinking about that. But I actually didn't find that quote, but instead, like, I found all of this writing of Trotsky, like, in the beginning of the Soviet Union, championing technology and championing, like, U.S. progress in technology and how the Soviet Union was so backward and needed to catch up. And, like, how, like, radio was so important. And, like, they needed to, like, make, like, and, like, just talking about, like, technological progress in the U.S. And, like, so certainly in the early Soviet Union, but also, like, for Marxists in the 19th century, like, technology was not a bad thing at all. It was, like, going to be the thing that's part of, like, driving forward, like, the possibility for socialism.
So one of the things that this is reminding me of, this is somewhat self-serving, but I've been reading a lot of Buckminster Fuller because I've been teaching.
Learning about what?
Reading a lot of Buckminster Fuller because I've been teaching.
Buckminster Fuller.
Yeah. And he has this really strange talk that he gives in the mid-60s, where he's talking about how the best thing that technology can give us is make work obsolete. Which is very much, in the matter of what's going on in the 19th century as well. That work is obsolete. But then he says that capitalism didn't do that. Socialism didn't do that either. And therefore, what we really need is, essentially, he's arguing for a new breed of technocrats. And in the manner of Fuller, where he always is claiming to be thinking peers ahead of everyone, he's saying this in the early 60s or mid 60s. By the mid 90s, you do have technocrats who are seemingly solving all these problems because politicians cannot actually take care of these. Because the best politicians can do is come up with socialism or capitalism, seemingly. And therefore, technology can actually, and I guess that's the point I'm trying to make, technology can take up a life of its own and do something to fix problems by way of circumventing the political process altogether. And I'm just thinking of that because, like now there's this new resurgence of the things that he was talking about, like universal basic income. I think he even calls it that. And they're very much, he's not a socialist by any means. He's very much in keeping with, he works for DARPA as well. I mean, I don't know what the hell he does, makes notes. But it just seems like there is at least maybe among some technologists or futurists, which is certainly what he is, there is a consensus that politics has essentially failed this. And so we need to find a way to fix problems, beginning with defining what a problem is, which is what technocracy really does. And technocrats really do very well.
Right. Yeah. That's really interesting. So there's I think there's this question of, yes, politics has failed, so we need to govern society with a bunch of technocrats who can do it better, who can better govern society. And I think that's part of this understanding. It's part of what people say about the internet now. The internet as a free frontier failed because of ISIS and Trump and Putin and China, right? Because the other thing, of course, what's right. So what we need is to govern it better by fact checking and being arbiters of the truth, etc.
But you also said you don't think people care about their devices spying on them.
Right. So the other thing, if you go back to this periodization, it's in the first period when George Orwell writes 1984, and he's talking about the Soviet Union, but also just the future authoritarian state. And it's in this, it's in the 2000s when basically everybody is on the internet and people spying on our every movement is completely normal. It's just a natural thing. So that when the Snowden revelations come out, nobody cares at all because it's weren't they doing that already? I knew they were doing that. You didn't know they were doing that?
That's true. I mean, I was going to say one of the kind of modern forms of Luddism,
right.
Is a kind of distrust in technology, and not in the sense that it's taking away our jobs, or not in the sense that it's turning us into monsters or whatever, but it's more people are surveilling us.
Exactly.
A lot of people tape over the cameras on their phones and their laptops, right?
Right, I know lots of people who work in technology who refer to what they do as they're building surveillance machines. This is the way that they talk about it, and the thing is they're sort of Luddites in a way. They turn out they have dumb phones. They don't use the modern internet. They only use text browsers. They do all these things out of that. But I think that's very fringe. I think most people don't care.
That's true.
Just I think the digital utopians are fringe, and I think the Luddites are fringe, and most people don't care.
Yeah, for most people, technology is just a distraction.
Or no, it's just a tool in everyday life. And I think it's in the 2000s when that just becomes this surveillance becomes totally normalized, becomes completely normal, and yeah.
What do you make of the argument that you hear a lot these days that the internet, by which I mean Google, Facebook, what have you, makes us the commodity?
Oh, that's true. That's true. All of the internet companies, the ones that make money on advertising, they're selling advertising to you. It's how that works.
I read an article a little while ago kind of proposing that we move away from this advertising model where you get Gmail for free in exchange for your privacy, arguing that we should be paying for things like email and Facebook, and that would be better than...
That might be a post-2009 shift. but I don't think that that's that's just like different businesses on the internet competing, right? Which itself like marks a shift away from like this like 90s or 80s dream of the internet as this like free association frontier, where like we're all going to be like alternate hackers and like be able to do things on our own, like have a homestead on the internet, and like it's a very different vision, which is very fringe. Like most people don't want that. Most people like want a business that they can pay to be responsible, and like a contract. And yeah.
Right. Does that like the frontier of the internet, like does it still exist? Right? Like I feel like it still exists, you know what I mean? But it's just that the internet has been so like dominated and colonized by the Facebooks and Googles that like the access to the internet is easier now. Right? Like the people that were accessing the internet in the early 90s or late 80s or whatever had to like try hard in order to do it. Do you know what I'm saying? That there was like a barrier to entry. And like similarly, I think that there's like, you know, a barrier to entry to like whatever the frontier of the internet is now.
But isn't that part of what the panic over the repeal of net neutrality is? That like without net neutrality,
no,
well, you have the specter of both the dark net and all of that.
Okay, so a few things. So there is like the dark net, which like a few people can successfully navigate, but like most people that try to navigate it like aren't really navigating it because they don't. It's like a challenge to do it correctly. So that, but anyway, like there, you know, when the dark net sort of became a thing in the 2000s, when with like these like massive, like basically like alternate eBays where you could buy drugs,
like Silk Road.
Well, like most of those, like there've been Silk Road, and there was like successive versions. Like most of them have been like cracked by the government, and like it's no longer like a really feasible model, right? Which is kind of like bears a resemblance to like the frontier just getting like policed, right? With the FBI, it's when the establishment of like this national FBI that like the gains that were left over from like Prohibition or during Prohibition really become like it's no longer tenable, right? So I think that's already happened. I think net neutrality, the question of net neutrality is just like it's just people can like have opinions about it, and maybe one is better than the other, maybe net neutrality is better, but like really it's just like certain capital interests versus other capital interests. There's the companies that are like doing well now with the status quo of the internet, and they're against other companies who want to change it, and that's it. It's not. If neither of them this question doesn't really have a bearing on the left, or like the left should. I mean, there's no bearing on the orientation towards socialism or freedom, except mostly. I mean that's right.
I mean, the fear I've heard lefties express, and honestly, I really, I don't understand net neutrality and not net neutrality as well as I would hope, but what I've seen people on the left panic about is that if you repeal net neutrality, for instance, nobody would be able to find Platypus 1917 anymore. Or they'd have to pay extra for it, which seems kind of fantastic to me, but I don't understand.
The Platypus organization already pays for a website. We do that already. So would we have to pay a different person for the website? Maybe.
Or more money?
No, the fear is that the user
but probably not, because the money that we pay for the website, or the money that websites cost, is there's a few middlemen that are making money, and then there's some technical costs, and maybe those middlemen will change, but it's not going to change a great deal, I don't think. I mean, the other thing about social media is social media is different in China. There was a conversation. There's been this conversation about the internet in China, right? The internet in China is fully policed, right? And there's social media, and it's fully surveilled by the government.
How's that actually possible? Just at the technical level,
well, it's just that the social media company is much closer with the government and shares data with them much more closely than of course social media in the U.S. and the rest of the world shares data with the government also, but not as closely, arguably. There's a question of that relationship.
So what do you think the cultural significance of things like social media is?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, I think that like it's certainly like does make atomize people and make them stupider. I think those are true things. But I think it's certainly possible that like there could be new kinds of relationships that are yet to be formed. It's possible. I don't know. I could see it going both ways.
Social media have brought about a pretty interesting phenomenon, tying into what you said about the beginnings of the mainstream internet, where people thought that things that had been heretofore impossible in the physical world were going to be possible now, and we would just be minds meeting, and thus, we would be more connected than ever to new ideas that we might have otherwise never encountered in our lives. That was kind of the feeling. And the advent of social media, if anything, have brought about an even further distance between people with, say, opposing ideas about a certain topic. Because social media today, such as Facebook and others, what they do is that they make it really easy through their algorithms to find people that already agree with you. So it is very easy to create your own bubble or echo chamber in Facebook, where you only have access to people that you agree with, and only have access to products and ideas that are pleasing to you. And you can easily block and unfriend anything and anybody that collides with your own worldview. And so I am wondering if people decide that they are just carry on with this model and have no say in it and let Facebook handle it, if that is only going to lead to further, let's say, social virtual fragmentation.
I have to wonder though if that's all very true. I wonder if this is unique to Facebook, or if this is not just like how social networks, IRL, like how we choose our friends and where we live. Would we not kind of be doing that anyway?
Well, the other thing is like, I don't think that the echo chambers themselves, that might be a phenomenon, but I think that, in general, social media, not because of who people talk to and who people don't talk to, it's just I think it makes people stupider. And, that is a separate thing from just who people end up talking to. It's just
why do you think that?
I think that because I just see it in myself. I find myself consuming all of this shit on the internet that it's basically tabloids. I read tabloids, but in the it's the only time I would ever read a tabloid in real life is if I was in the grocery store and picking it up while I'm in line in the grocery store, right? For the 5 minutes I'm in line. But with the internet, I find myself reading that quality of journalism and information all the time. And so it's that on the one hand. It's just the quality, what I'm reading.
Yeah, but it's fun.
It is fun. It's addictive. But
Or do you think you're making less conscious choices about what you consume?
the other thing just is if all of the world's information is so easily accessible, there's a question of what do you need to know, or what's worth knowing, what's worth learning, and I find that sometimes I'll go off and read interesting things, but often I'll just consume sort of crap, which is as bad as television, I guess. So it's basically just television.
But is it possible to say that you don't have to have this low effort engagement with reality? Why don't you read good things? No one's stopping you.
I could, but
isn't that
I do the same thing, though.
I think that's the wrong question, because the thing is what is it's not it's what do people actually do? I'm just revealing my Luddism. But
I have trouble
I want to
escaping
get back
the
to
memes
so-
and shitty tabloid clickbait crap sometimes. So, and I mostly read. I don't even watch TV. So,
I want to get back to the question of
Like the identical
Luddites
twins
as well,
in
because
Hawaii.
there's one kind of understanding which is just the opposition to the unstoppable force of technological change. That's kind of one way of thinking. But the other, there's this kind of problem of labor, which is that the Luddites were originally these spinners and weavers who were doing incredibly well, and actually were so wealthy. They were the wealthiest people in town always, like people who were working in a specific industry. So there's like they would drink so much on Sunday that they're not going to work on Monday, and so it would be Saint Monday. That's what they called it, like Saint Monday holiday. And they would walk around with like money, like 1 and 5 pound notes in their hats instead of feathers, just to show how rich they are. And so in some sense it was also this problem of kind of dramatic loss of not only livelihood but also almost like social status. And this is not, this is of course before trade unions, so this is not the hard-fought kind of, post 48, I suppose, hard-fought victories of trade unions, which is kind of giving people the right to have some free time or, the 8-hour workday. It's none of those things. It's literally that there is far more work than there are workers, and so they are incredibly well paid. And to me it seems like there was that moment, perhaps there wasn't such a moment for technology workers as well. There was far more work than there were workers. Maybe, I don't think that's true anymore, because literally everyone I meet is an engineer, so,
He's a software engineer.
Is a software engineer, yeah.
Of course, like software engineers are not real engineers.
Is that
If you talk to like any actual engineer, they'll be like, "Oh, you're not a fucking real engineer. You're a software engineer."
Right, yeah.
Like, yeah.
And then there is like, but there is also that same question of like, it's not simply that work has been lost, but the meaning and like the status associated with work, not status associated with particular work, but actually just the pleasure that one gets out of being employed. Quite frankly, like that is itself getting lost. So I don't know. Like I feel like there is something about like trade unions maybe were something like allowing for some activity outside of work, which of course don't exist anymore.
It kind of raises the question, like, I didn't know that the Luddites were so well paid, but like, would it like when software engineering becomes automated, like, will the software engineers destroy the machines?
Yeah, I picture that happening.
That probably is already happening, but I mean, like, they're like, usually the systems are so well like redundant that like you just have to fire the worker that does that if they fuck up, whether intentionally or not.
And there were already cycles like people who knew old programming languages, people who know like programming languages that were big in the 80s, no longer find jobs because every 10 years a new programming languages come out.
Yeah, my
That's
dad.
like going to be one of the things I was interested in bringing up, I guess. Like this is constant reinvention within capitalism, where like increasing technological innovation kind of requires the creation of these types of jobs, and that was part of the motivation for Luddites, I guess, like opposing that process. But there's a point where technological development becomes so great and jobs become so superfluous that there's like a breaking point, and that process can no longer continue, or can capitalism like infinitely reinvent itself?
Well, I think that future technical progress is certainly like possible and likely. Just because Moore's law is done doesn't mean we're done at all. I think that like there's many new kinds of innovations that are possible and that could happen. The thing that's interesting is like there haven't been that many deep ones lately, and like sort of the main ones like are pretty old. Like it could just be that like taking the theory that was like developed by von Neumann and Alan Turing, and then like in the subsequent 20 years, and just like applying it more and more could still like give self-driving cars and all these things, take us to space and whatnot.
I think the other interesting process for me is like the decreasing connection between what you do and I guess the connection between your activity and the food that you eat and the shelter and the things that you need for life. jobs really feel superfluous now.
Yeah.
Like I used to work in marketing.
Me too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like it felt like this superfluous go between companies that wanted to sell their goods and consumers that wanted to buy them. To some extent, it didn't even matter if we existed.
Right. I know, it's really funny.
But the only the importance for those types of jobs we had, I guess what I found interesting, I was working in this big office in the financial district, and like I was on the 19th floor, I went down to the 18th floor, there's another like floor of cubicles, different in a different marketing company, it's all the same. And like there's just so many people living out their lives in this way. And a lot of the time these jobs are really depressing because you've got like asset managers and stuff. But like when, is there a point when that job really starts to feel so superfluous? Jobs have always been hard, I suppose, but when you're working on the fields or whatever, there's a clear connection. There's a reason for why you're doing it, that's clear. When you work for a marketing company, they get less clear. So maybe that's one way in which there's like much actually fall apart.
I think it's like a different kind of alienation. Like there's the alienation of the factory worker, which is like as his job becomes smaller and smaller and like he has less and less control over it, it's like what the hell is he doing? And that's like continued to happen. So that like office workers are like, I don't even know what the fuck I'm doing, but like I'm doing something because like why they're paying me. I don't know why. But like I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. But like there is actually something that you're doing. But you just might not know what it is. But there's a reason why they're paying you, because they're not just wasting the money, probably. Right? If they continue to do that, they'll probably lose. But there's probably a reason. So that it might even be completely opaque to you, the one that's doing it.
Yeah, and the word reason is interesting there, because like, there's a reason, there's always going to be like a capitalist reason, or like a capitalist rationality for why you're doing some kind of operation, like in marketing, for example. Like, theoretical communist utopia, like you would need so much marketing, you might still need some marketing in a sense, in a different way. But in that sense, maybe there's no reason for so many people looking at marketing. I didn't mean to keep using the marketing example.
No, it's a good analogy, because I thought the same thing when I was working in marketing.
I mean, you mentioned that they're still paying you, but like for all we know, the social system has gotten so irrational that a great deal of these jobs actually don't create value, don't need to be paid, or maybe value itself has become such an incoherent concept that value creating labor is itself nonsensical.
Yeah, I mean, I think that a big thing that consultants do is they just like outsource responsibility so that somebody can say, oh, well, somebody else told me to do it. So it's like, it's a question of like office politics. But like, that's like...
Yeah, and there's a reason for it.
There's like some reason for it. But it's like, it might be like completely opaque.
Maybe we should break into smaller conversations.
Cool.
Because of the space.
So I think
I think a break and people can get more drinks.
Yeah, I want another beer. But for our next salon, I think we'll aim to have it in a salon.